Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. And for this lecture, we're going to continue on with our narrative in China. And we're going to pick up after the death of Qin Shi Huangdi. After the death of Qin Shi Huangdi, his dynasty failed after about 2 years. China disintegrated back into warring kingdoms. Just as the Mediterranean world and the Indian subcontinent disintegrated into warring kingdoms, fractured states after the fall of the Argead Empire or the Macedonian Empire, or with the fall of the Mauryan Empire. Everybody's region sort of just flipped into sort of provincial power blocks supporting one warlord or another. Now, in India, this would remain the norm until the Gupta Empire rose about 600 years later. In China and the Mediterranean, starting around the year 200 BCE, two polities would emerge that would unite the entire region under their control and establish fairly stable imperial structures that would last for the better part of about 4 centuries. Now, these two successful empires are the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean world and the Han Empire in the Far East, in China, in the core of the Chinese civilization. Now, these two states originates at roughly the same time, and they last for roughly the same period. They were roughly the same size, and had about the same population. So there's a lot of comparisons that we can make between those two states. Now, falling back to China. The Qin dynasty troubles began almost immediately after the death of Zheng or Qin Shi Huangdi. His eventual successor was allowed to rule, and he rules in even a more high-handed manner than Qin Shi Huangdi. And this overburdens the peasantry. He imposes higher taxes. He imposes a harsher penal code, and he forces more and more people into those labor camps that were used to construct those public works. The aristocracy and the surviving intellectuals, they're also resentful because they have been degraded. The aristocrats are no longer hereditary powerful magnates. They're being sidelined, and of course the intellectuals, the Confucian intellectuals, they're being sidelined altogether. They're being eradicated. Qin Shi Huangdi did pursue that policy of book burning and execution of intellectuals, and the burden of this blow, the major impact of the blow was felt by the Confucian scholars. So there you have like three potent elements of Chinese society, of Chinese civilization, that are opposed to this dynasty, that are really feeling it. And then the treasury is drained. They go into they have these sort of fiscal panic because of all these building projects. And the empire erupts in a massive revolt with different factions competing with each other, all vying with the Qin, all vying for power with the Qin, and all trying to supplant the Qin. Now, one of these faction leaders, Liu Bang, rises from the chaos and founds a new dynasty, the Han. And the Han, the name Han simply comes from a tributary of the Yangtze River, and that's where Liu Bang was from. Liu Bang was a very unlikely candidate to become emperor, or even an unlikely candidate as the progenitor of one of China's more influential dynasties. Liu Bang was a Chinese peasant. He was described in his youth as an uneducated, womanizing, lazy, unemployable drunkard, and that's from official accounts. He reformed his ways, became a headman of a village. He became a general in command of one of the rebel peasant armies, and he was not particularly skilled as a general. He lost nearly every battle that he fought under his direct command, except for one. His real talent was in organization, conflict resolution, delegation of authority, and keeping unlikely alliances afloat. And those are just as prized, or even more prized in a leader, than actually being able to go out there and win battles. Those are the seeds that germinate to to grow the plant that is a strong government. And these skills enabled him to succeed through war and reign in peace. Now, Liu Bang is an individual in Chinese history who rose from the peasant class to all the way to emperor, and that is remarkable. It's remarkable to iterate that he was able to rise from the very lowest ranks of society to the very highest ranks of society. And what is even more striking, what's even more remarkable about his career is that he remained illiterate throughout his life. He came to rely on the scholars to oversee bureaucratic affairs, but he retained his peasant contempt for scholars. One of the things that the peasantry liked about the Qin dynasty was that they were hard on the scholars, and the peasantry were also hard. Also had this sort of dislike of all these fancy book learners and so forth. So that was one of the things that endeared the Qin, and it's one of the things that endeared Liu Bang to his subjects, to his peasant subjects. But even with his peasants' contempt, he nevertheless used Chinese scholars, these scholars, to bring about a period that produced a golden age of Chinese culture. The Chinese began to call themselves the men of Han, or the sons of Han, during this time and afterwards, because of the greatness of this dynasty. Now, Liu Bang's cleverness lay in keeping the strong centralized administration working on all syllables, and by combining the principles of legalism with the concepts of Confucian virtues. He reduced the forced labor, he reduced taxes, he rescinded the ban on Confucian and Zhao literature, he encouraged intellectual pursuits, and the result of all this was an intellectual renaissance in China. Liu Bang harnessed the abilities of the educated elite for the benefit of his state. He did this by establishing a highly ordered but not hereditary system of office advancement. And this was all based on merit or talent rather than on birth. Now, to select these talented persons, he had an elaborate examination system established. The exams were based on one's knowledge of Confucian texts. And the prospective civil servant would then take these exams, and if they did well, they would rise in the bureaucratic if they did well, they would rise in a bureaucratic core based off of their intellectual and organizational skills. And the empire was subdivided into 100 governmental regions, which were further divided into 1,500 districts. These were staffed by the bureaucrats, and there were 20 levels to his imperial bureaucracy. And his imperial bureaucracy employed an estimated 130,000 civil servants, and these civil servants they were charged with overseeing the collection of taxes and the construction of public works and the recording of actions and deeds and so on and so on. The Han emperors were also endowed a national university that would serve as the bastion of knowledge for future civil servants. Now, in theory, this exam system rewarded an individual based on merit. In practice, however, it continued to favor the wealthy. It favored the sons of the wealthy because it was only the sons of the wealthy who had the time who could afford to spend their time devoting to study, devoted to their studies. The exam system did allow the Han Emperor to identify the most gifted and industrious of their elites to come in and to serve them and to serve their empire. Now, this was a change from the old social divisions. The old social division was a very rigid system that enforced a separation along aristocratic and peasant lines. The line was now somewhat more fluid between the peasant and the bureaucrat. The Han continued Qin policies such as military conscription, forced labor, and forced labor was vital for the maintenance of infrastructure. It was vital for the upkeep of roads and canals, and of course they continued the Qin standardization of the Chinese. The Qin standardization of the Chinese written script and the Qin standardization of the weight measures and currency system. Now, the Han Dynasty would last from 202 BCE down to roughly 220 CE, 220 of the Common Era. The fusion of legalism and Confucianism, the joining of the practicality and the ethics, would serve as the model for all of their future successors. This set a pattern in Chinese governance that would endure for the next 1500 years. Liu Bang's heirs continued to follow his precedent, and they continue to do all of this until the reign of Wu, of Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 80 BCE. Wu began Wu began this shift from the Confucian model to the Shin model. Wu was known as the martial emperor. He pursued a very aggressive, expansionist foreign policy. He pushed the imperial boundary to their then furthest extent. Under Wu, the government bureaucracy became more heavily centralized, while industries such as ironworking, copperworking, salt mining, and even liquor, even the alcohol business, the alcohol industry, were taken over by the state and held as state monopolies, and these were very fruitful monopolies. They brought in a lot of revenue for the government. Now, this was an early foray into the concept of government regulation of prices. Taxes were also raised under Liu, and he did all these. He made all these economic moves by the direct state to support his army, and with all the imperial resources of China at his back, Wu was able to call up upon an army of 100,000 soldiers. He brought the northern reaches of the Indochine, Korea, southern Manchuria, all these regions, the border regions, under Chinese control. Now, Emperor Wu's bigger problem lay to the north, where he launched repeated expeditions against the nomadic peoples, the nomadic peoples to the north of China. One group, a confederation of tribes in particular, stood out, and this group is known as the Qiongnu. They were fierce warriors who fought almost exclusively from horseback, and a controversy does exist. I want to highlight right now. A controversy does exist about their identity. The Qiongnu are thought to be the Huns, or at least the progenitors of the people who will become the Huns. And the Huns are a group we will discuss later in this course. But the Qiongnu, they are true nomads. They do not establish any permanent cities or camps, only temporary settlements. They specialize in horseback archery, a skill that was honed at a very young age among the men. Emperor Wu mounted expensive campaigns to subdue the Qiongnu, but because he lacked target sites or a definitive territory, a bit of real estate to conquer, he could not pin them down to one location and defeat them. Despite their evasiveness, Wu does seem to Emperor Wu does seem to have been able to drive them out of China. He's not able to deliver a death knell defeat to them, but he is able to drive them out of his domains. And despite their evasiveness, despite the fact that they can appear out of nowhere, Emperor Wu does succeed in building a series of fortified outposts. Now, this strategy was only partly successful, as various nomadic bands can still raid the western borders of his empire. Now, Wu's constant campaigns depleted the treasury, drained national resources, and caused the peasants to rise up against him. Now, Wu responded by doing something unique. He apologized to the peasantry, and instead of going out and repressing them, of brutalizing them, of simply forcing them to obey him, he changed his behavior, he changed his policies, and he began issuing edicts that expressed his regret for his past behavior. And he promised to be a better ruler in the future in these edicts. And true to his word, he changed his approach to governance. There's a direct switch from a heavy focus on warfare to agriculture and trade reform. He built a canal connecting the Yellow River with the Han capital, Chang'an. And he linked the two very important regions together, and this fostered economic activity within China. During the Han period, trade and commerce thrived due to government policy, due to the safety and the stability created by the Han. The most significant aspect of the Han economy was the silk trade. Silk is being produced at this time, and of course, silk production is really made by the little silkworms. They produced the fabric, and the fabric was a Chinese monopoly that was coveted by the Chinese, and all other cultures that were exposed to silk, they wanted to own it. They wanted to have this very vital resource. Now, the Mediterranean world very quickly developed an insatiable taste for silk, with silk becoming a great global luxury. The Han, at a stroke, were able to establish both the silk industry and the Silk Road and reap the enormous financial benefits from the silk industry and the silk trade. This permanently linked the great civilizations together. China, by firmly entrenching itself along the Silk Road, became the far eastern terminus of a great terrestrial trade arc. We now see China, India, Mesopotamia, the Nile, and and a little later on the Western Mediterranean, all being linked together in the name of commerce, in the name of this great exchange. The origins of this particular trade route really predates the Han, but it is under the Han that regular caravans start out to travel to cover those vast distances to make sure there are regular shipments of silk going west, and that China is able to harness resources from the west to bring back to the east. This would begin in China with horses carrying silk, and they would carry these horses up until they hit the region around Bactria, and then they were sort of the goods would be switched over from the horses to the Bactrian camel, and the camels would then be driven to ride out to because the horses couldn't survive the harsh conditions of the Asian deserts. The Bactrian camel could, and this would sort of be the first early exchange point on the ancient Silk Road. And of course, from the camel caravans, they will pass through several more middlemen before ending up on the shores of the Mediterranean. Now, by 100 BCE, Romans had become addicted to silk, but there's no direct contact ever established between the Romans or the Han empires. It's remarkable that they arose at the same time, that they began to make their big imperial plays at the same time, but they don't establish any sort of regular contact with each other. Instead, what happens is that the middlemen, people like the North Indians and the Parthians, and a group that we'll get to later, these groups along the Iranian plateau and along North India, along the Indus and the Ganges river valleys, sorry, they actively sought to discourage any interaction between the two, and this was done to ensure that their positions were kept, that they became the only points of contact between the supplier and the consumers. Now, silk is credited with bringing huge amount of wealth into China, but it is a very labor-intensive commodity to produce. To produce 150 pounds of silk, you need around 750,000 silkworms, and each of these worms need to be fed. They need to be cared for and managed. And the prosperity of the Han rested on their ability to foster economic and technological advancements, which would lead to new innovations and new technologies. It is during the Han that true paper was made from wool pulp from the first time. Prior to that, scribes had been writing on strips of bamboo, that were tied together to make sheets. The Han also produced the horse stirrup, the spinning wheel, the horse collar, which makes plowing even more efficient, and of course the wheelbarrow. Now, the Chinese also excel at maritime innovations, and Han ships are built with multiple masts, what we would call a true stern post, the true stern post rudder, and of course magnetic compasses also come into play with Chinese maritime activities. In the realm of geometry, Chinese scholars calculated the value of pi. In health science, they discovered the circulation of blood within the human body. In decorative arts, the Han era covered this period of elaborately. It oversees the production of this very elaborate and highly decorative style of porcelain, and we still use this highly decorative and elaborate style of porcelain. We call it China. We generically call it China because the earliest examples of it were made in China. Fine China is still something that a lot of people keep locked away in a cabinet. The Han Dynasty can be broken up into really two phases. The early Han from 202 BCE down to 9, the common year 9, and the later Han from 25 to 220, to the years 25 to the year 220 of the common era. During the interregnum between those two dates, there were a number of colorful figures who all rose up to vie for control. The red eyebrows were one group, and this was the group that painted their eyebrows red. Mother Lu was another one, and Mother Lu was a landowner who became a pirate queen. And like Wu, Emperor Wu, the later Han emperors concentrated much of their resources on combating the incursions of the Xiongnu and trying to control various border provinces like Korea, Vietnam, and Manchuria. And all of those border provinces broke away during periods of internal weaknesses. And the border regions served as buffer zones, protecting the core provinces of China from invasion. The Han was an outward-looking dynasty, stimulating trade with other states. And in the final years of the Han, many of the old imperial difficulties began to surface again. During the final years of the Han, we begin to see is that they begin to suffer difficulties related to taxation. They began to see imperial court intrigues. They began to see the personal ambition of their subordinates flare up to contest the rule of the legitimate dynasty. The border regions became increasingly sophisticated, and they began to launch more aggressive attacks, all of which strained the Han economy. And these factors came together to act in concert to undermine the Han in the year 220. And with that, we will conclude our examination, our look into China. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. As always, I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.